Thank you for listening to this episode of History Exchange.
Danke, dass Sie wieder dabei sind bei dieser Episode von History Exchange.
Further information can be found on Center Austria's homepage www.centeraustria.org.
Und auf der Homepage des Instituts für Zeitgeschichte der Universität Innsbruck www.uibk.ac.at/Zeitgeschichte.
Today is the 16th of October, 2023. My name is Eli Musso, and I'm here with Yvette Rubio. We are sitting in the Earl K. Law Library at the University of New Orleans. Our guest today is Dr. William Fitzhugh Brundage, who is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We are speaking with him via Zoom. William Fitzhugh Brundage is the William B. Umstead Distinguished Professor of History at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research focuses on American history since the Civil War, specializing in the American South, historical memory, and racial inequality and violence. He is the recipient of many awards, including the Charles Sydnor Award for Distinguished Book in Southern History from the American Historical Association. He was a 2019 finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History for Civilizing Torture in American Tradition. His most recent history is as editor for the New History of the American South released in May 2023. Professor Bischoff and Professor Brundage attended Harvard Graduate School together, and their friendship continues today.
Thank you for joining us today to talk about your relationship with Dr. Bischoff. We've heard that you've had a long and close friendship with him. Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship that you've had with him?
It is long. It started, I believe we were in the same entering year in grad school. I'm pretty sure we were. And so literally when I arrived in grad school, one of the first people I met was Günther. And he was, he's a very outgoing person, so it's very easy to get to know Günther. And he was certainly not only very outgoing, but also somewhat exotic in that he was the first Austrian, what would be the right word, Austrian villager I had ever met. And he was very proud of his roots in a village in Austria. So he was not only, as I say, very easy to get to know, but also very colorful.
How have you stayed in touch over all these years?
Well, in part, it's because Günther's in New Orleans, and it's always fun to visit him in New Orleans. And because I happen to do Southern history, I have occasion to go to New Orleans, but we've also managed to cross paths. I actually once got him to come up here to Chapel Hill to give a talk. I've been to New Orleans a few times to give talks. So we've been able to make sure our professional paths cross, but we also have found other occasions. And in my case, I got married in New Orleans, and Günther and Melanie were important parts of that event. So we've just made sure our paths cross. And he's also wonderful, as you know. Not only is he a very outgoing person, but he's a very caring person. And so he's always conscientious about dropping me an email periodically to remind me to fill him in on whatever's happening, and he fills me in on what's happening with him and his family.
What are some of your favorite memories of your times with Dr. Bischoff? Melanie told us that you used to come every Friday for dinner while you were in grad school. Is that true?
Sometimes we certainly did, but I think in grad school, some of my memories were he was always, in grad school, it's very easy to, at first you're a tight cohort of people who are working together in classes, and then you start working on your dissertation, and you start sort of, and people go off to do research, so there's a certain degree of entropy that happens. But Günther was always great at organizing get-togethers, And his get-togethers were always exceptional, in part because Melanie's father would ship up crawfish from out in the bayou. And so you could get together in Boston in the 80s when, and nowadays you can get frozen crawfish lots of places, but back in the 80s, crawfish were incredibly exotic in a place like Boston. So get together for some Louisiana food in Boston, those were good times. So it was in part the festivities he organized. I think another thing about Gunther is he's very his interest, his curiosity is very Catholic, lowercase c, so that when you got together at Gunther's house, Gunther's apartment, it wasn't going to be just the people who did exactly what you did, but there'd be people who did all sorts of history across all sorts of periods of time. So it was always exciting and fun. And so that's what I really associate with Gunther's time in Cambridge.
So as you mentioned in your first response about Dr. Bischoff, that his pride in being Austrian, what is your first image of, or what comes to your mind when you think of Austria?
Well, in my case, when I think of Austria, I of course think of Vienna, and that's not, well, I mean, Gunther knows Vienna intimately, of course, but Gunther's world, as I understand it, was the other end of Austria. And what I do remember is people commenting, those who spoke German, on how Gunther, of course, can speak High German fluently, but he also can go into his village dialect, in which no one, apparently, no German speaker who's been trained in the United States could possibly understand. So, and then listening to Gunther talk about the kind of intricacies of Austria's geography and history was very striking. The other thing I would say that was very striking to me about Gunther is hearing Gunther talk about his father's experience. And I may not have the details right, but my understanding is that his father was in Soviet prisoner of war camps for an extended period of time after the war. And so to hear someone of Austrian descent, well, an Austrian, talk about World War II the way Gunther did, and about this sort of mythology of Austria's participation in World War II, and then his father's own horrific experiences as a prisoner of war, that was a very, what would I say, enlightening experience for me.
And if I'm not sure this question is something that you'll have an answer to, and so it's fine if you don't. But your area of research and Dr. Bischoff's area of research seem so different. And how do you see yourselves, or what has brought you together as historians?
Well, in his case, he's again, he has very, I say it again, he has a very Catholic interest in history, so that it's always very easy for me to talk to Gunther about what I'm interested in, and vice versa, because I guess I share some of his curiosity. I don't know anything as a scholar about post-World War II Europe, but listening to Gunther was always it's always very, very interesting. And I enjoy that. I think the other connection, of course, is that Gunther has this deep connection to Louisiana through Melanie and his time in Louisiana, both before graduates, before coming to Harvard, and then since, so that he's very curious and interested in the history of this remarkable place where he lives. I don't want to disparage, say, Charlotte, North Carolina, but I don't know if Gunther would have had the same passion for the local history of Charlotte, North Carolina that he has for the local history of Louisiana. and especially southern Louisiana. So I think there's that. But finally, there are these kind of interesting ways in which our interests overlap, and that is, I mean, it's very, very specific to research interests in certain parts of our career, but I think it speaks to a kind of deeper interest. For example, my interest in prisoners of war, which began when I was writing about torture, brought me back to one of Gunter's very first works, in English at least, the book that he co-edited with Stephen Ambrose on the prisoners of war controversy in the immediate aftermath of World War II, which was a hot issue when I was in graduate school because there was a very polemical book published then. And so decades later, I became interested in prisoners of war, and our paths crossed there. And I'm continuing to write about prisoners of war now. So that would be one example. Then back when I was interested in the subject of lynching, Gunter brought to my attention that there were lynchings of American pilots, for all I know, maybe British pilots as well, bomber pilots in the later stages of the war, with the Germans encouraging kind of vigilante action against bombers. So there are these very specific intersections where we could find commonality. But more broadly, I think, in addition to curiosity, both Gunter and I have what I would call a kind of, I don't want to suggest other historians don't have this, but both of us sort of foreground what I would say are ethical dimensions to history. And I know it was very important for Gunter to challenge the mythos of Austrian innocence before and during World War II. And in my own work, I've been concerned at sort of puncturing some of I'll call them myths for lack of a better word, some of the myths about Southern history. So I think in that regard, we have a kind of very broad commonalities.
All right, so let's talk about you some. So why did you become a historian? Why did you decide to do that?
I'll have to say, there was never a moment in time when I would just describe it as inevitable. As a child, I had a passion for history that was now I recognize as uncommon. And when I went off to college, I didn't have any academics in my, certainly no historians in my immediate family. So I didn't know exactly what an academic scholar did other than write books. But when I went off to college, I was either going to be an anthropologist or a historian. That seemed the most likely thing. And as I say, I didn't know exactly what that meant. But I thought about maybe law, like many people, as a practical alternative, but it never appealed to me in the least. So certainly by my junior year of college, I knew I was going to go to graduate school and pursue a PhD in history. So it's one of those things where I can't say, I would have to tell you my life history, which is not interesting for you to see how it is that I became a historian, but I think it was virtually inevitable.
Was there anyone that you could call a mentor for you to do that, or?
No, it's interesting. I'd have to go back into my childhood so that the mentors were the books that I read, not people, and the books that I was enthralled by. So certainly once I got to college, there were mentors of one kind or another, especially in graduate school. But no, I'd say books, not people.
So, like you said, like a book helped you out to decide that to go into history. Do you like one specific book, or was it multiple different books?
Yeah, this is a good question, and in the sense that, if there was one specific book, and I'm not alone in this, if there's one specific book, because I was a child in the 60s, there was still the sort of shadow of the Civil War centennial in the late 60s, when I was really sort of beginning to develop interest. And we had the American, what's called American History Illustrated, or American Heritage Illustrated History of the Civil War. And the book is beautifully illustrated. It's well written, but in particular, it has these wonderful battlefield maps, which are just, you'd have to see them to appreciate them. But for a child, a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, they were mesmerizing maps. They're almost diorama-like maps. And the reason I mention them is because they are a static map, and yet the way they are designed, you're supposed to be able to read the evolution of the battle of, say, Shiloh or Gettysburg. And so the reason I mention them is they were visually captivating for me as a child, but there was also a historical narrative explicit in them. And so I could stare at them and just simultaneously be paying attention to how a historical narrative is created, but also being sort of emotionally involved. So that book, and I'm not a Civil War historian, it didn't mean that I became a Civil War historian, but it created this sense of history for me as something that was very dramatic and involved understanding relationships between events over time, which seems a grandiose way of saying, in other words, it made me interested in history. But in a sense, reading that book and those maps started to give me a sense of a kind of historical method. And so that I would say that's really the origin point.
So you've selected some really hard topics to write about: violence, torture, and lynching, some examples.
Yes.
So how do you keep yourself sane or keep going when writing about this topic?
Well, now I'm writing about prisoner of war camps, and someone recently said to me, and I say this somewhat, this is a grim sense of humor, but they said, "What's your next book going to be on? Mass murderers?" And no, I don't think so. But I have, I did think about writing a book about kidnapping in 20th century American history. But guess there are two things that explain my interest in how I deal with them. One is I've only come to realize this over time, and why I keep gravitating, as you say, to these grim topics. I am interested in how human beings, and the human beings I'm most capable of studying as a historian, are Americans, for a variety of reasons. In any case, I'm interested in how human beings under extreme circumstances respond, and how they make the choices they make, and the extent to which ethical considerations inform the choices they make. So that's how I come to those topics, and to the extent that I keep from being really depressed, in every instance, I am interested by those people who make what I would describe as the best choices they can in those circumstances. And so with the history of lynching, it's a horrific topic in which there's complicity by all manner of people who should not have been complicit in lynchings. And yet there are always individuals and groups who heroically, in some instances, denounced lynching or tried to stop them. Likewise, in the history of torture, while torture has at various times been almost normalized or indeed normalized in American institutions, there have always been powerful voices of dissent. So it's the seeing people in these extreme circumstances, very dark situations, and yet some display a kind of courage that I'm not sure I possess. And so in that regard, it's even in this very dark topics, I find something that is restorative.
That's really great, because I don't know if I would be able to do it, honestly.
Well, yeah, I don't know whether it also says something about my own character that, others may judge better than I whether there's, a dark, sinister theme in my character.
Oh, I don't think that means that. I think it's just maybe you're like strong-willed, you know what I mean? So, you've also had so many different accomplishments throughout your career. What are you most proud of?
No, I don't know that. I don't know that I see it in those terms. In that I don't. I think like a musician, which is what I wish I could be, but can't do that. Like a musician, I've never had a performance where I thought, oh, I nailed that. That's exactly how I wanted it to be. But arguably the least, quote unquote, important book I've written is still my favorite book. I wrote a book about an obscure group of, I call them utopian socialists, but that's just they're really socialist communitarians in Tennessee and Georgia. And in many ways, that's my favorite book, because it's a dark book in a way, but it's about a group of people who fascinate me because many of them risked everything for this vision they had. And it's a modest book in ambition and scope, and yet it came closest to achieving what I wanted it to do. So that's the thing I'm happiest with. Maybe if I was going to say anything that I'm proud of, it's that I am as curious about history today and as hungry to learn more about the human experience now as I was at any time in my life. And so to that, again, I'm not sure I would say that's a matter of pride, but it's a matter of great satisfaction that I still am as passionate about history as I ever was.
That actually goes to my next question. How has your field changed over time?
Oh, that's a question I've gave thought to when I was writing the introduction to this edited history of the American South. I would say the field has been transformed since I was in graduate school. Probably the last time it was transformed comparably was in the aftermath of World War II. It's a drastically different field in many, many regards. Just to give you a few examples. One, it is far more inclusive than it was. The history of women in the American South is now a very, very robust and essential element of the history of the region. The history of Black people in the American South has of course continued. I mean, it was important before, but it has been fleshed out and is absolutely fundamental to the history of the region in a way it wasn't to the same degree when I was in graduate school. Indians in the American South have gone from being almost invisible to now being a very prominent element, and especially, up into the present, but especially in the pre-U.S. Republic period. And then I would say the early history, from pre-contact to the period of the American Revolution, has been utterly transformed. So I think it'd be fair to say the field has been deepened almost beyond recognition. And one other way in which it has changed is, of course, when I was in graduate school, when I entered graduate school, most of the scholarship on the South took it up into the 1960s, maybe the early 1970s. Well, now the scholarship from 1945 to 2000 is very, very robust. So the South necessarily looks very different as we start to incorporate more and more of the post-desegregation South into that history of the region. So I would say it's a field profoundly transformed.
So you were talking about the book that you recently edited and wrote the introduction to, called A New History of the American South. So what is new about it?
Good question. Well, I think I've touched on some of the things that in sort of practical, prosaic terms, we tried to foreground the history of African Americans, Indians, to the same degree, to the extent we could, based on the scholars we had. In other words, we tried to foreground that history in ways that reflect the new scholarship. I'd say another important element of the story is that we didn't conceive, and this element of the story is especially important for the first third, maybe even a little more than the first third of the volume. And that is, we didn't conceive the history of the South as the history of essentially English and or European settlement of the region. So we don't start, so to speak, at Jamestown and then move west. Instead, our field of vision is essentially the boundaries of what we conventionally think of the South from 1000 AD to the present. And the way that changes the history is it means that events in Jamestown, well, they're important, of course, but events in St. Augustine, Florida, at the same time might be equally important, and events out in amongst the Choctaw might be very important. So there isn't a presumption that the story of the South can be told from the vantage point of a specific group, because it's not clear. It certainly wasn't clear until probably roughly 1820, between 1820 and 1830, that the future of what we think of the South was going to be dictated by white Anglo-American settlers. So I'd say that's probably the newest aspect of what we've done.
So I have one last question for you. In your opinion, why is history important today?
Well, of course, I would say history is important always. So it's the history is important for the same reason now that it was important 100 years ago, and I hope will be important 100 years in the future. To me, I'll tell you what I love most about history, and this speaks to the curiosity that I mentioned with regards to Gunther. As a historian, you can study every element of the past. And, for example, if you're a musicologist, you might study the past as well, but you're going to study it through the lens of music. Whereas a historian, you can study the past through the lens of music or art, economics, politics. So virtually all aspects of the human experience and the experience of humans in nature are the preservative of a historian. And so I know it's a cliche to talk about, well, we need to study history and the arts so that we can understand what makes us human. And that's certainly a reason to study history. But to my way of thinking, the reason to study history and to study the past is it's precisely how we can have our fullest comprehension of ourselves and the world we live in. And I know that it's very generic, but I don't see any other way to possibly do that. And if we don't do that, it's as though we're not using half of our brain. Our brain, the human imagination is obviously perhaps not to the degree that it has been for me, for instance, in my passion for history, but all of us are historians in our daily life and at moments of great importance in our life. And the historian's job is to take all of those disparate experiences and pull them together into a narrative that really does help us understand, as I say, the human condition. And so it's not that only historians can do it, but historians are the only people who do it in the way that we do it, in the fullest, most inclusive understanding of the past. So, I think history is, we live in an age of STEM right now, but I'm optimistic that somehow history will survive even the tsunami of all things STEM.
Thank you, Dr. Brundage, for your time today. But we do have one last question to close out our interview. What is your favorite New Orleans food?
Ooh. There are many, but I would say my favorite New Orleans food are Gulf Coast. So it's not specific to New Orleans, but there's nowhere I would rather eat them. Raw oysters in New Orleans, to me, and I say this from somebody who lives in an area where there are aficionados of Chesapeake oysters. And I'll go on record here. I've never had a Chesapeake oyster that I would eat if I had an opportunity to eat a Gulf Coast oyster. So Gulf Coast oysters in New Orleans, that would be my favorite.
So, Dr. Brundage, is there anything else that we might have missed or anything you might want to say about Dr. Bischoff before we close out here?
In thinking about it, I'm not sure I would have anticipated that a villager from Austria would be ideally suited to the cultural and just the whole milieu of Southern Louisiana. But I can't, having seen Gunther in Southern Louisiana immersed within Melanie's family, I can't imagine anyone who would be more naturally suited. It's just like, it was like the perfect meeting point of Austria and Louisiana. So it's always a joy to see him in that milieu.
Thank you again.
Yes, thank you all.
Danke fürs Dabeisein.
Thanks for listening. We hope you'll tune in to the next episode. More information can be found at Center Austria's website, www.centeraustria.org.
Und auf der Homepage des Instituts für Zeitgeschichte der Universität Innsbruck www.uibk.ac.at/Zeitgeschichte.